engineer will walk again with us in the field, and the geotechnical engineer will point out areas where they want to do further studies, where they say, I'm a little uncomfortable with this area, we need to do more borings here. We're going to do some more studies, and then we're going to give you some parameters about how to realign the trail. Or we may say, you can build the trail here, but in this area you need to do some extra mitigation for the stormwater runoff. Or the geotechnical engineer may look at the trail alignment and say, you know, I'd be more comfortable if you just moved the trail 10 feet over. So there's kind of a wide range of responses that they might have. So we'll end up with some alignment adjustments and mitigation requirements from the geotechnical engineer. Then we go into trail construction. So the trail gets built on that final alignment. Then we enter into the evaluation phase. So there'll be a big party, the neighborhood will come, and we'll start using the trails. And then for the length of the pilot project period, there will be periodic evaluation and maintenance. And then at the end of the evaluation period, it will be determined from the criteria that have been developed whether the project was a success or if it's a failure. In either case, whether it's a success or a failure, updates will be made to the green space and bike use policies. If the project is considered a failure, then trails would be decommissioned. Okay, so that's the process, and I'm kind of going through a lot of detail to give you the basis of how the design gets done. So I'm going to talk a bit about some of the site analysis that we have been able to engage in so far. So we have received the results of the preliminary geotechnical evaluation by Stantec engineers, which will be posted shortly. And their study covers things like slope, landslide, and stormwater issues. This map, and I have to really apologize because the technology is not working for us. We brought a stick with our PowerPoint and we put it in this little machine, and it's doing some weird things with the graphics. So I cannot guarantee how this is going to turn out tonight because this graphic has been turned sideways. We'll just have to cope somehow, and I hope you can understand.
Would it work better in a different computer configuration?
If we were able to plug it into a laptop, I think.
I have a laptop.
Do you think we can?
You don't want to try it?
Mike.
Okay, well, why don't we go for a few more slides, and if we need a laptop.
Well, here the picture has been turned sideways compared to the information on it, and if that continues through the show, we're going to get in trouble here pretty soon. I'll continue to describe this one while she's grabbing your laptop. So this outline is the outline of our site, and all this is showing is that our site, like so much of Seattle, is made up of glacial deposits, and basically there are two separate layers of glacial deposits exposed on our site. And the contact between differing layers is often the cause of instability. However, the important conclusion of the geotechnical analysis is, in general, it is our opinion that an acceptable route for both a perimeter trail and cross trails can be located on the site, provided certain site-specific landslide hazard areas are avoided, proper analyses are performed after the trail has been laid out in the field based on preliminary design, and adequate precautions based on these analyses are taken to minimize additional erosion. And that's the process that I just described earlier. After the field layout, they will make these kinds of recommendations. She's got
Do you want to switch, or do you want to just play with it? Just go ahead. And then it's just here if you need it.
Okay, well, maybe we'll find out. The text box. I can talk about this for a few minutes. So Stan Tech drew circles around some general areas of concern, and they pointed out specific documented landslides. They are not saying that trails cannot be built in these locations, but that these are areas where they are likely in the field to make field determinations for slight route adjustments or to call for further analyses in order to determine the best route. So now I think we're going to take a slight pause while we try to see if I can walk this. Oh, I can talk about the next one. So, we wanted to give you a bit of a primer on topography and slope, since these are really key drivers of how the schematic trail plan gets laid out. The general landform of our site is a slope with areas of gentle ridges and valleys. The highest point on the site is up here by the golf course at elevation 328, and the lowest is down here by the Andover Street right-of-way at elevation 118. If we look at this flattest slope range, 0 to 5%, which is fairly flat, you can see there's a big patch here, and that is the park's materials storage yard. And then there's another little flat area beyond that, which we're kind of excited about it because it's kind of a neat plateau on the property with some nice views through the trees. And we think it might be an interesting place for people to be able to get to. Most of the site is in this 5% to 40% steepness range. Now, 40% is the code definition of a steep slope, so it may come as a surprise that the site has only actually very limited areas of actual code-defined steep slopes. Our steepest areas right here are in the 60 to 80% steepness range, and they look like they might have been created artificially when this park storage yard was graded. Now, this category, 80% and above, is quite steep, and we don't have any of that on our site. Let's see if I'm capable of going on to the next. Okay, so slope is used to describe the site, but it also pertains to the gradient of trails for pedestrians and mountain bikes. So I'm going to show you some examples of some slopes that are significant in trail building and design. 5% is a well-known gradient because it is a gentle gradient that can be managed by most people in wheelchairs, and people know about 5% from wheelchair accessibility. To keep mountain bike speeds safe, slow, and appropriate for all ages, the maximum sustained downhill trail gradient we're designing also should be about 5%. And for you to be able to picture what 5% looks like, it just so happens that a lot of Chiste Boulevard is about 5%. Okay, 8%. Columbian Way happens to be about 8%. So, and 8% is also acceptable for accessibility at certain limited distances. To make mountain bike trails fun and manageable for all ages and abilities, 8% is our target slope for sustained uphill climbs. You may wonder what happens when mountain bikes go down to 8% slope, but what you also have to remember is that the mountain bike trail component is strictly one way, so mountain bikes will only be going uphill on 8% gradient. .40% is not a particular breakpoint for trail building, but it is a point of interest, as I mentioned earlier, that per Seattle Municipal Code, steep slopes are defined as at least 40% in slope and at least 10 feet tall. Now, 50%, pedestrian trails are quite good at climbing steep slopes. Seattle Parks has standards for pedestrian trails, that slope up to 50% with the 0 to 20% without steps and 20 to 50% with steps. Okay, according to the LiDAR topography that we're working with, the very steepest slope on our site is 70%, 77%, and that's what that looks like. Now, I wanted to talk about 100%. 100% sounds like it ought to describe a vertical cliff, but in fact, 100% is equivalent to 45 degrees, or some people say a 1-to-1 slope. 100% is Seattle Park's standard back slope for a trail that traverses a steep slope. It's also the steepest slope that is advised for Bowman trails traversing it, but in fact, we have no slopes on our site that are as steep as this.
You want to keep going? I've got to take the flash
Okay,
drive out of
we'll
here.
wait till we run into trouble and then we'll do it. Okay.
Thanks, John.
Okay, so another way of looking at it. This is a simplified contour plan showing ridges and valleys, similar to situations we have on this site. So ridges look like this, and the valley looks like this. So, if, for instance, you had a property line that, if you had a property line that was running across the ridges and valleys, and if you wanted to build a trail that was parallel to the property line, the trail would go up and down, it would go up the ridges and down in the valley. So this is called cutting across the contours. This is pretty easy for a pedestrian trail to do since they can climb hills at up to 50% gradient, but it may not be possible for a mountain bike trail that can only climb up to 8% and can only descend up to 5%. Another way of laying out a trail would be to follow the contours. So this is following and crossing the contours occasionally. And that gives you a gentle, steady ascent. Now, a further bit of background information. While pedestrian paths have more capabilities for climbing steeper slopes, bike paths have more capability for traversing a steep slope. So this sectional view shows the potential impact of cutting a trail into the very steepest slope on our site. When you cut a trail into a slope like this or this, you have to create a steep back slope. That's this 100% back slope. A mountain bike trail can be as narrow as 1 foot wide. A 1 foot wide full bench trail with back slope at the recommended maximum of 100%, 1 foot, and then the 100% back slope, impacts a swath that's about 3 1/3 feet wide. A 4 foot wide pedestrian path with the same steepness of back slope impacts a 13 foot wide swath. This obviously has a much bigger impact on vegetation and possibly on stability. And it explains why we are more willing to traverse steep slopes with a bike trail than with a pedestrian or a multi-use trail. Somehow this is going much better now. So I'm going to talk for a few minutes about wetlands.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's only going well because John's right there.
Yeah, as soon as you get up, it'll help. Okay, so these blue spots down here, it's a little hard to see the property line, but between the property line and Rainier Vista, these wetlands were actually delineated and mapped as part of the construction of the new Rainier Vista development. This wet area and this little stream were observed and noted in the vegetation management plan, but have never been officially delineated or mapped. So we kind of adapted what was shown in the VMP to what looked like was likely according to the topography that we have. But what kind of parameters do wetlands impose on trails? I thought it would be interesting to look at what the Seattle Municipal Code has to say. According to the code, many kinds of construction projects must abide by certain setbacks from wetlands. However, the code has a specific exemption for, and I'm just going to quote it here, public projects where the intrusion into the environmentally critical area or buffer benefits the public, such as trails providing access to a creek or wetland area when located and designed to keep environmental disturbance to a minimum. The applicant shall protect vegetation and trees pursuant to a tree and vegetation plan consistent with best management practices. The plan shall be prepared by a qualified expert with experience related to the type of environmentally critical area or buffer where work will occur. In landslide-prone areas, the plan shall also be approved by a geotechnical engineer or geologist licensed in the state of Washington with experience in analyzing geological hazards relating to slope stability and vegetation removal on steep slopes. So, during the design and construction process, we will meet all of the code requirements just mentioned. The goal of the trail proposal and a value that we heard expressed in the PAT meeting so far is to make sure that the project ends up being a net positive environmentally. That means restoring and improving wetlands, routing the trail around wetlands where possible, and when crossing wetlands and their buffers, use details and methods that allow us to tread lightly and to maintain habitat function and quality. While we don't have definitive up-to-date information on wildlife and vegetation, the assumption that we are making is that restoring native plants improves habitat for animals. And as Doug pointed out, the environmental consultant that Parks is engaging with is going to find more information on this topic. But here's an update on restoration activities in Chisi Green Space. These white areas are areas that have not experienced any restoration. This kind of orange area is a place where actually a homeless encampment has been removed and invasives restored, and it's ready for going to be ready for planting. The green areas are current or recent planting areas, and then the darker areas are areas that have been planted and are now in an establishment or monitoring phase. So to begin to address wildlife, we had a conversation with a wildlife biologist and a professor at Seattle University named Mark Jordan, who has done work in the Chisi Greenbelt. While his studies don't directly inventory wildlife or assess the quality of the wildlife habitat, he's very familiar with the area, and he had some interesting comments about habitat intactness. So intactness is a measure of wildlife's ability to move around without impediment. And it's also a statement of having adequate interior space rather than edge space, because some species prefer more interior space. So these are pertinent questions for this project, is whether or not trails create edges. Do they actually fragment the intactness of habitat? So we asked this question of Mark Jordan, and I thought he said something interesting. He felt that this parcel over here, which is Chisi Green Space at Mountain View, he considers this to be an intact patch of wildlife habitat, even though it has a trail system in it, which you can lightly see in these like little white lines. So even though there are 4-foot wide gravel-covered trails, and it has undergone a lot of habitat restoration, he considers this an intact patch. In fact, he said that whether this area and these large lobes of our site could be considered one whole intact patch, even with Columbian Way going right through the middle of it, depends on the species. For most species, this is not intact. But for some birds and some larger animals, for instance, such as a deer that might cross the road at night, this actually could be considered an intact patch. He doesn't really consider this northern part of Chisi, of our site, intact because of the narrowness of it and with the residential uses. and the house cats, et cetera, also close by. So these